Hello, this is Mark Stevenson. Thank you to the organizers, the Sachs Associate, for the invitation for me to talk today about Thermo Fisher's response and actually mobilizing our company's response to the pandemic. In particular, I'll focus today on diagnostics, what we've done in diagnostics, but I'll touch on other areas and really try to share some of the lessons learned, both for us as a large company in trying to mobilize the depth and breadth of our capabilities at scale during these last 180 days or so, and also, what I hope for the industry as we look forward in terms of what we've learned from this and what hopefully some of the lessons will continue forward. In terms of those who may not be familiar with Thermo Fisher, we're a large global company, about 75,000 employees with about $25 billion of revenue, based here in the US in Boston with our headquarters, but very much a local company with operations around the world, focused on particularly the pharmaceutical and the biotech companies, but also serving the academic and other industrial markets. Really what we've tried to build over the years is an industry-leading scale, because we think for a lot of our customers that scale matters. So in that global footprint in manufacturing and access, but also depth and breadth of capabilities. We spend about $1 billion each year on innovation to make sure we're very innovative and bring a lot of applications expertise with that innovation to our customers. So the mission for the company is to enable our customers, very much focused on our customers, to make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer. And of course, during the pandemic, for our colleagues, for our customers, this couldn't be more enablement of our mission. And so we've been very much focused on, firstly, making diagnostic kits for this pandemic, and I'll talk about that specifically today. Also, we make general laboratory chemicals, and we turn that chemicals into serving our customers, making hand sanitizer, repivoting our chemicals manufacturing, as well as ensuring our customers could continue to operate. And so ensuring personal protective equipment, masks and gowns and other equipment for our customers. So in terms of what we thought about when the pandemic first came to us, for us in early January in China with our customers there, we certainly found, and this is a slide from later that Bill Gates wrote about this, that really was pitting all humanity against the virus. And I think in that view, we've used that as a guiding principle to how do we best respond to societal needs. Not only once we have a vaccine and therapies, but now in this time of what are the policies to limit the spread and the role, very important role of testing to prevent spread. And this was very much a guiding post for us as we thought about how to work together with the research community, with governments to address this pandemic one. Now, in terms of, as we then organized our response, what we first saw and began to saw was, of course, complete shutdowns. A lot of our customers were based in laboratories. That operation shut down early in China, followed in Europe, followed in the US, the wave drove across the world. And so we had dramatically reduced customer activity related to those disruptions. We also supply regular diagnostics in transplants, immuno-oncology, that we also saw a dramatic decrease for. But on the other side, we started to see increase in products, and those might have been, for us, relatively normal regulars. The last panel was talking about minus 70 freezers necessary for the vaccines. It's one of the things that we supply. And so suddenly seeing spikes in those, in supplies for mRNA, as well as this increased focus on diagnostics that caused us to respond. So as a management team, we set up not only to actively manage our costs during this time, particularly in March, April, unsure what it looked like, what did costs look like, what did cash flow look like, but at the same time pivot to meet the other demands that were necessary, for example, in diagnostics, and how do we enable, for across 75,000 colleagues, prioritization decision-making. What was also different for us in this side was the changing requirements of governments and our customers. We were used to our customers giving us regular forecasts of the demands for the year. Suddenly those were dramatically different, as were governments reaching out to us. I worked personally with the US government, with UK governments, with other governments around the world in terms of how did they mobilize. And so that really caused a change. As well as research. We supply research tools like electron microscopy, which was used early on to study the structure of the virus, examine the spike protein. Some of the things you've heard about are important, as well as what did it mean for uninterrupted supplies. So this was really the view we took to mobilize that response. What I'll take a moment to go further is to, particularly today, focus on global testing, and I'll end a little bit on the therapies and vaccines. So in terms of testing, when we first saw the virus, what became relatively clear for us in this slide, if you haven't seen it, was a sort of simplified view that actually there's a period when the RNA viral load is doubling and growing that we need to detect the virus. And so for us, getting an assay out that was incredibly specific, we used our bioinformatics to design 3 areas across the genome to use PCR, which is a long history in qPCR in the technology of Applied Biosystems, one of our brands, to develop up a PCR test. We've also been working and having evaluation antibody tests, both total antibody to look at the IgG response, but also IgM, and also looking at spike protein assays for looking at the efficacy of vaccines and also continuing looking at the durability. So getting the sensitivity right on the test was early on. We designed a test that would allow us to detect 10 copies of the virus. The next challenge was actually getting the right samples to do clinical trials and then submitting that to initially the FDA, now 51 authorities around the world for validation of the gold standard PCR assay. And that's what we focused on doing early on. What quickly became, a challenge, and having done this before personally for Zika and other infectious diseases, MERS and others, was actually the scale necessary to challenge this. And also the necessary for other ancillary supplies that quickly became in short supply, and swabs and viral transport, given the scale of testing that started to appear in March. So this slide here shows some of the period for us from March through to September. So from first being granted the FDA emergency use approval in March 13th, I was actually at the White House on that day, to go from having a kit and a workflow to scale that up to all the install base of instruments that we have around the world running these type of tests was the quickest way to get it out to laboratories. And then we announced in that time we would scale the assay up to 5 million reactions per week. And we've been on a path to double that every couple of months or so. We're currently scaling up our capacity to make 20 million tests a week. We've also started to make around the world this assay, so we've got supply chain. And also to give you a sense of the instruments as well, which somewhat are harder to scale. Manufacturing, we currently do these qPCR instruments, which is very common for us. We're making what we normally make in a year in 1 quarter, and that kind of expansive supply chain, instrument capacity, factory is just unprecedented for us. As we look forward now, some of the challenges we see in our innovation and what we're currently focused on is firstly, we see in the labs just coping to get the turnaround time down. So, for example, in Europe, we equipped 3 mega labs in the UK, lighthouse labs, but these labs need automation because the workers were initially staffed by volunteers from universities, from other areas that hopefully are now beginning to come back to work and study. So we're just launching now a highly automated system that will do 6,000 samples a day. Give you again the scale of internally in the company. This was done in 5 months with 220 people working across 5 different businesses and 8 different sites across the world to get this out, and our first couple of systems shipped last week. You know, the other issue on people's mind, while the flu cases have certainly been low as we look at cases in the Southern Hemisphere and Australia and Argentina, if you look at the outbreak, you know, we still want to be prepared. Are those symptoms of people back to school, back to work, and the screening we're now seeing going on, are those COVID or other viral pathogens with similar flu-like symptoms? And so have been scaling now the assays and clinical trial for adding a multiplex pathogen with flu A, flu B, also requirements in other territories like Europe to add RSV, as well as just a host of other respiratory pathogens. We've added 40 onto one of our array platforms that we'll be launching here in time for the flu season in the Northern Hemisphere. As I mentioned, one of the other challenges we've seen is, you know, taking the swabs. Initially, that was in short supply, people scaling different swab suppliers. We also need to make sure that the swab is then correctly transported to the lab. And so one of the things the governments have now been involved in is scaling that capacity up. In the US, we won a government contract to scale up a brand new facility. We scaled that up between April and July 4th to start manufacturing this 8 million tubes of viral transport media a week. And similarly, I've just started doing the same thing in Europe, firstly with the UK government in Perth in Scotland. And so this kind of scaling is what's necessary actually across the supply chain to make sure that the supplies aren't in short supply as we go forward here into the winter season. You know, a word about Thermo Fisher as well. So Thermo Fisher has kept all its sites operating during this time, but like many, you know, we've also reduced density on site. We've worked with local authorities, and so we have defensive controls you see on the left of this slide in action, risk mitigation on site, social distancing in our conference rooms, cleaning. We have temperature thermometers in the reception areas as well as questionnaires. What we've recently added is testing to our protocols and strategies, and had many discussions now with other employers of how should the testing protocol look like as we test not only sick people, but also look at testing in the workplaces. You know, the question of sort of why testing, and, you know, one of the, you know, interesting, you could argue powerful natures of how this SARS virus is that it turns out, you know, about 40% is the estimate of cases are asymptomatic. And that may be fine for the person, but not for the ability of that person to transmit it, to travel. Of course, you know, face masks certainly work, and this is the case that we're finding in our workplace. But in addition, we want to test for asymptomatic, and actually have begun testing and do find asymptomatic cases in our workplace. You know, as you come to think about if you're going to employ testing in the workplace, you know, a couple of considerations. I won't have time in this talk to go through all these points to consider, but certainly, you know, we see speed continue to be important if you're going to track and trace. We think ideally the lab time is under 24 hours in the turnaround time, so we're working with all our lab partners to make sure that is. We also see increasing rapid antigen type testing coming out, which I think can have some great advantages, particularly cost and speed in turnaround. It does have some lack of clinical sensitivity, so, you know, PCR remains the gold standard and often is the reflex test. You've also got to be careful if you're getting false positive tests as well as false negatives. We've seen a lot of customers move from the deep nasal pharyngeal swab to the sort of mid nasal, which is convenient. I personally had 2 COVID tests myself last week, self-administered with one of our partners, and that works relatively well. We also see a saliva-based test. Some challenges of those depends on what you've eaten and drunk that morning, a little more contamination, although they're very convenient. And then, of course, throughput. You know, as I flew back actually from the Europe recently into Massachusetts, you have a test 72 hours before arriving back into Massachusetts. You can also imagine trying to board the plane, but I worry about how do we align people as you test quickly to board or as you get off. So these are some of the considerations. No test is perfect. I would put the proviso out there, and still clinical symptoms matter. So that's some of the incredible work we've been doing. It continues. Our point of view is, you know, we're going to be testing all during 2021, and so this continues until we get a vaccine, until we have therapies. You know, meanwhile, we've also been responding to what's going on in the vaccine world. Many of you know, and I'm sure our partners with us, we work in scaling up single-use reactors, in cell culture media, in analytics for the viruses, as well as in our pharma services, working with clinical trials and manufacturing. So we're currently working on about 250 COVID-related projects, trying to see what does that mean. Are we going to scale up distribution as well? And the cold chain, as the previous panel mentioned, is also important, understanding which of these are coming through. You know, one of the very, different things I've also experienced here is also partnering with governments. I think normally we're used to partnering with the innovators and the biotech companies themselves. In this case, one of the areas that's turned out to be quite critical is how do you fill and finish the vaccine. And more the governments have sort of put in this horse race, I would say, at least all the horses are going to come through the final stages. You need to fill and finish, and that's one of the services that we do. So we've entered into long-term arrangements with the US government and also with working with some other governments around the world to be able to fill these vaccines and billions of doses into vials at the end of all this process. So that's an update on what's been going on with Thermo Fisher, and hopefully some thoughts on what we've been doing over the last, as I say, 6 months or so here. And with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you and moderate a Q&A. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. Yes, I'm Mike Ward. I'm the Global Head of Thought Leadership at DLG, which is part of Clarivate, a company that is a global leader in providing sort of trusted information and insights to, I guess, accelerate the pace of innovation across the whole of the healthcare spectrum. So, Mark, thanks very much for the presentation. I mean, you gave us a very, very detailed and, I guess, an impressive response to how your company has coped both internally and externally to the pandemic challenge. To what extent? Okay, so if we think back, in the early days, to what extent did the business continuity planning processes that you had in place prior to the pandemic, how did they enable you to pivot so rapidly? Or to what extent were you actually having to almost create new tactics on the hoof?
Yeah, Mike, the business continuity plans, I mean, normally you're planning for, other disasters, fire, supply chain risk, you have those scenarios. Those certainly work to the extent of continuity. So clear site leadership, local on-site presence, security over the global sites. So I think all that worked pretty well. We hadn't, specifically envisaged a pandemic, and I heard on the panel people talking about COVID-3, so certainly we would keep that in mind. I think what was different was to pivot resources from when you suddenly have one area of your business, declining by 80% and one area doubling in size. So that pivot of resources and moving people around, moving teams to do different things was what required some nimble, center-directed help, but also sort of mission-driven. I think as I sort of used the Gates slide, we used that to say, can we mobilize effort against society as a common enemy here at the virus?
So, Mark, as you sort of reflect on the progress that the company has made, you sort of mentioned how certain parts of the business were doing really well, and others were sort of clearly in decline or in sort of almost like in rapid free fall. What, as a management team in those early days, what do you think was the most consequential decision that you actually made that has sort of helped you build in resilience to the whole pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, early on it was very unclear, what the future looked like, right? Did it look like a cash crisis? Was everything shutting down for good? The very short term was pretty dramatic. And the most consequential, thing that we took was to manage for the medium and the long term. So, we actually worked, the whole company, worked as one to say, let's take a decision, we'll work as one. Even if one area is going down, one area is going up, we'll work as one. But let's not do things that would damage the business for the medium and long term. As it's happened, what we found is actually the medium term came round. The worst wasn't as bad as we thought. It's maybe longer than we thought. But I think in that period of uncertainty, we didn't, take any rash decisions. I think at the highest level, we tried to be calm, although it was a very uncertain environment to work through.
So, I mean, one of your slides, you showed, again, the sort of almost like the defensive strategies that you put in place, whether it's social distancing, the fact that the sort of the capacity of your sites had been reduced, et cetera, et cetera. With those defensive strategies, I mean, you also mentioned early on about how you were sort of you were thinking about sort of cost mitigation but sort of ensuring productivity. With the defensive strategies that you put in place, how has that impacted productivity, and have you had to reset your business performance expectations for this year?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the defensive side, what we were trying to do was make sure we conserve the business, and demand is still down from people who are not out operating normal labs, and doing research and production in other areas. Still, we're seeing clinical trials slower outside of COVID. So, some of that area we've certainly seen impacted. What we tried to do was reassign those people and capabilities to other areas. And so that's been the mitigation for us in this sort of COVID response. And, generally colleagues within the company have sort of, again, been motivated by that societal need. And that's been the response. And we're now seeing good reaction from, the community. And I'm actually, positive, as I mentioned, going forward, in the second half of the year, we get back at least to what is this new normal that we're seeing that includes for us operating businesses in the way they're operating with face masks and other areas, but the labs are back at work and running, and that's what we're seeing as we also visit, customers as well.
Okay, so I mean, so you talk about the new normal, and I think that's an expression that people have come to embrace this year. It's certainly something that is repeated quite often. Of the sort of the business practices that you've had to put in place in response to the pandemic, which one of those are likely to be retained and almost become permanent behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the timeline one of what does it take to get a new product out, what does it take to scale that product, is just broken what anybody thought was possible in the timeline. We've never taken a diagnostic product, scaled it up, and got it out to millions a week shipping. And so, that's what you'd like to keep. The key question is, well, how do you get that and how do you keep those behaviors? And clearly, we're still reflecting on that, but some of the things were clear, very much a mission driven, fully resourced, multiple work streams in parallel, and working with key suppliers as well to work with them to scale their supply chains. That's all come through as we sort of look at, well, what did we do differently and how could you do it? You're not going to do it with everything you do across the business, but certainly when you look at what's possible, you sort of reimagined and actually done something that is totally different to do at scale and speed here.
Right. You mentioned about supply chains, and again, I mean, I think that was one of the, I guess, one of the sort of the weaknesses potentially for a global industry that was exposed by the pandemic. There are obviously different ways that one can sort of, again, repivot the sort of supply chains, whether it's through business innovation, whether it's actually bringing suppliers, etc., much closer to home, or diversifying, in fact, your sources of raw materials. What is the thinking at Thermo Fisher?
Yeah, Mike, I mean, you're absolutely right. Supply chain was one of those areas that was highly tested and found to have certain weak points in it, even for us scaling up across different areas that, even our kit, is tens of components in a kit, or it has plastic components in it that needed to be scaled. So I think multiple areas, are true. One is a diversity of supply chain. You need multiple suppliers. You need to assess their ability to how can they scale. And so we've continued to look at that. We continue to look at freight. When the air traffic freight is when the reduction in air traffic happens, you also lose freight, and also some of the customs we saw shut down. So putting things across borders, we saw took longer. And so I've looked again at sort of closeness of supplier. And then just what are the critical raw materials? It turns out, some of us all have the same raw materials in our supply chain, and they all go back to, one source supplier. So as you actually look at your components, what's in that needs to be, careful what's in that critical supply chain.
So, as sort of executive vice president and chief operations officer, you're responsible for the company's life sciences, analytical instruments, laboratory products, and specialty diagnostics businesses. As again you sort of look and sort of see what is happening, what do you sort of see? Is there going to be a rebalancing of what Thermo Fisher looked like 2019 as to what Thermo Fisher will look like in 2021, 2022?
Mike, no, I think it looks pretty much the same going forward. I think, the market environment I'm actually very positive about. I think, governments appreciate and customers about life sciences, so we expect, good funding. I think, the presence of pharma and biotech will continue to be well funded, and all of that source as well. I think maybe the only part I hope will continue is the collaboration that's occurred between the industry partners, between governments. That's certainly an area that I would like to see continue, and optimistic that it will.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, I guess there's one final question, because unfortunately we're running out of time. What do you think the most important lesson the industry has learned from the pandemic experience, and what have we got most to be optimistic about?
Despite the quick response, you still need to be prepared, and so I think preparedness is important, both for internal areas of the company operations, for us as a life sciences group, as we think about, new viruses, this isn't likely to be the last. It's the first global pandemic, so ensuring research and surveillance continues. All of that, to me, seems important as continued preparedness after this current pandemic. But I'm optimistic, as I say, that we've learned from this and actually will carry on some of the positive characteristics about speed of clinical trials, partnering across the industry, that will continue going forward here.
Great, Mark. Well, as always, it's a pleasure talking to you, and thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us, and good luck with all the efforts that you guys are making in all the sort of the various touch points you have in, I guess, the industry's response to the pandemic. So thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. Good to speak to you.